We've confessed through song this morning that God is the only one who can rescue us, and we called out to Him on this last song, saying we lift our eyes to Him, looking toward Him, and that's kind of where we're going to be heading this morning in our text. You know, summer is a time when there's a lot of hit and miss, right? I mean, you go on trips, you go do vacations, and sometimes you're here at church, and then you maybe miss a week, and you're back again. Maybe you miss a couple weeks, and you're back again. And you kind of lose track of where we are. And so if you've never been with us before, this will be helpful. If you've missed a week or two in the past month, maybe this will be helpful. But we are in a series now on the life of Solomon. Maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't, but we've been walking through his life together. We began this on May the 31st, and you might remember on that Sunday, David was still alive. David is Solomon's father. He was kind of oblivious to all that was going on, and Solomon's brother tried to overthrow the kingdom. And in that time, David set Solomon up as king. He's anointed as king. He becomes king. He's established as king. David gives him some directions. We talked about that. And then Solomon acted on the directions that David gave him. He took care of some pretty bad dudes, right? You remember that whole setup, and we kind of walked with Solomon through that together. And then last week, we found Solomon asking, or really in this situation where God is asking him, what do you want, Solomon? Whatever it is, I'll give it to you. God's almost like a genie in the bottle, right? And what does Solomon ask for? Solomon doesn't ask for wealth. He doesn't ask for riches. He doesn't ask for a long life. He instead asks for wisdom. And that's where we found ourselves last week. Just to review, 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 7 through 9, we read, "Now, Lord my God," this is Solomon speaking, "you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but now I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties." You see his humility there in the text? Solomon's like, I don't know what to do here. Your servant is here among the people. You have chosen a great people, too numerous to count or number. So what is Solomon going to ask for? Whatever you want, Solomon, you got it. Solomon says, so give your servant, what? A discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? A discerning heart. I love that phrase. Certainly we would all do well to ask God for that, wouldn't we? Solomon knows he wants to do the right thing, but he knows he cannot do the right thing unless God empowers him to do it. He knows he cannot lead the people if God does not give him what he needs to do that. So Solomon asked for wisdom. He asked for a discerning heart. So with this in mind, we come to the latter part of chapter 3 today, and we find a story where Solomon is using this wisdom that God has given him. You've probably heard this story before. It's a pretty famous story, but we're going to study it together this morning. I'm going to invite Shelby Harris to come, and we've been kind of doing this in different ways through the summer, but I think it'll be helpful this morning just to read the entire story in one space, and Shelby's going to do that for us. And let me ask you to leave your Bibles open, because we're going to go back and we're going to study this text verse by verse. So go ahead, Shelby. This is 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 16 through 28.
Now two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, "Pardon me, my lord. This woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't my son I had born." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. The king said, "This one says my son is alive and your son is dead, while that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive." The king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave the order, "Cut the living child in two, give one half to one and half to the other." The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." But the other one said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." Then the king gave his ruling. "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from the God to administer justice.
All right, thank you, Shelby. How many of you have heard that story before, right? It's a pretty familiar story. Let's walk through it together this morning. We begin here in verse 16. Now, two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. Now, these prostitutes, you might say, well, goodness, how did two prostitutes end up before the king? Let me tell you a little bit about prostitutes in the Old Testament. Prostitutes, or sometimes translated the word is harlots, are found throughout the Old Testament. You see them in numerous places. In the ancient Near East, many of them were a part of cultic worship. There were also many prostitutes living in this area. Now, the thing about prostitutes in the Old Testament, many of them were sold into slavery, and that's how they became prostitutes. Many of them were actually sold by their parents for money, and that's how they ended up as prostitutes. To be a prostitute in the Old Testament was a sad situation. You see, women could not take care of themselves in this day and time. And in many ways, this was the only way that they had to make a living. And so on the socioeconomic scale, prostitutes were all the way down at the bottom. Now, you might be asking, how did they end up before the king, right? Why did Solomon take the time to hear the case from two prostitutes? I think that shows us something about Solomon, doesn't it? It says something about his heart, that he's taking the time for the lowly here. Now, one thing about coming before the king in this day, when you brought a case before the king was the Supreme Court of the day. What he says is going, okay? So they understood that. Notice their posture as they come before the king. Look, they respond in verse 17. One of them said, "Pardon me, my Lord." They're coming with a very humble heart, and this woman begins then to explain her situation to Solomon. She says, "This woman and I live in the same house." Again, that would not have been uncommon for prostitutes because they have to make a living, and so they're living in the same house. They're sharing a house. She says, "And I had a baby while she was there with me. The third day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby." So the babies are 3 days apart. "We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us." Now that is key there, that whole phrase. There's nobody else in the house but the two of us. You see, that's the problem here, because if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 19, when you bring the law out, you read this: "One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of" what? "Two or three witnesses." And so the lady who has stolen the baby understands this, doesn't she? She knows that there's not enough evidence on the table to convict her. This gives us an idea of how challenging this situation is for Solomon, doesn't it? Let's keep reading. Verse 19. "During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him." Now, very likely she could have rolled over on him. We also know from modern science there's something called SIDS, right? Sudden infant death syndrome. That may have been what happens. Either way, the child is dead. And look at what happens next in verse 20. "So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast." In the middle of the night, she switches the babies out. Now, it's worth noting here, the babies are both what gender? They're both what? You can talk. They're both males, right? They're both sons. Now, that's interesting because sons were extremely valuable in this day and time. So it's not just about the child, it's also about the fact that once the son grows up, he could perhaps rescue his mother out of prostitution, right? So the women, for them to lose a son is not only to lose a child, but it's also to lose their economic provision or their potential for economic provision. So either way, the one mother whose child dies switches the baby out with the other mother. The speaker continues the story in verse 21. "The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. What a horrific experience, right? To wake up to a dead child. I mean, that is unbearable. Perhaps she's crying. Perhaps she's screaming. And at first she doesn't notice, but then she notices the identity of the child. At first it must have been a relief, right? To say, this is not my son. But then the question, where is my child? What happened to my child? Certainly she goes to the other lady and discovers that her child is the one who is alive. Again, one other lady in the house. I can't imagine that she thought she would get away with it, but she certainly thinks that she has a shot. Again, she knew that there were no other witnesses. She knew that the situation was one in which no one else would be able to figure out the truth. In some ways, it's surprising, isn't it, that these women are standing before Solomon, but they are. And again, the Bible doesn't tell us how they ended up there, but there they are before the king. The situation is complex. The situation is difficult. They can't do a DNA test, okay? They don't have that. They can't go to the father. Most likely, they don't know who the father is, right? And so here they are standing. It's her word against her word. Look at what they say here. The first woman is bringing the case before Solomon. She's stating her experience. But then in verse 22, we hear from the second prostitute. The other woman said, no, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours. Verse 22. But the first one insisted, no, the dead one is yours and the living one is mine. And so they argued before the king. You can picture it going on there, right? I mean, Solomon's sitting here trying to hear the case, and they get into it with each other. I mean, it's like the Jerry Springer show or something here, right? I mean, they're going at it with each other. People are probably having to pull them apart, right? The two babies are there. One is dead. One is alive. And these women are going at it. Solomon's thinking, what am I going to do? There's no DNA testing. I can't go to the father. They don't have any baby pictures. I don't know how I'm going to figure this thing out. You can feel Solomon's frustration in the text. Look at verse 23 here. The king said, this one says, my son is alive, and your son is dead, while this one says, no, your son is dead, and mine is alive. You can kind of see him maybe just throwing his hands up in the air, going, I don't know how I'm going to figure this out. It's her word against her word. This is where the story gets interesting. Again, we don't really know how long the argument lasts here. Surely the lady who is in possession of the child feels like she's going to win this one, right? It's her word against the other lady's word. What would you do if you were Solomon? I don't know. If I'm Solomon, I'm thinking, get these ladies out of here, right? I can't decide this. I don't know how to figure this one out. But look what happens next. The text simply says, then, verse 24. Then the king said, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword for the king. He gave an order, cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other. Now if we back up just a bit, last week we understand Solomon has been given tremendous wisdom by God, right? In fact, the Bible tells us that he has more wisdom than anyone has ever had. He has more wisdom than anyone is ever going to have. That's how wise this guy is. And now he's saying, bring me a sword because I want to cut the baby in half. You got to be thinking everybody standing in the room is going, what? Are you kidding me? Maybe Solomon's just frustrated. And Solomon, maybe you shouldn't take it out on the baby, right? We don't know exactly what's going on here. May seem like a strange order, but Solomon knows what he's doing, doesn't he? He gives the order, and as he gives the order, he's closely watching the faces of the two women. And I would bet that as soon as the word came out of his mouth, he knew the identity of the real mother. The response is telling here. Look at verse 26. The woman whose son was alive. Notice the author of 1 Kings is telling us right here who the real mom is, right? The mother whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. Again, as soon as Solomon gives the order, he sees it. Now, it's interesting to note here that the Hebrew word that's translated in your text, deeply moved in the NIV, the word literally means to grow hot. Have you ever had that experience? Maybe it's anger, maybe it's emotion, but as soon as something happens, you can feel the blood rush into your face, right? You can feel the heat. You feel like your head's going to explode, right? That's what's being described here. And I would bet that as soon as Solomon says the word there, he watches the face of the two women, and the one woman's face grows red, and he knows that's the mother. That word grow hot here is in Lamentations chapter 5, verse 10. Our skin is hot. The word hot there is the same Hebrew word that is in our verse translated as deeply moved. Can you imagine what the real mother felt when she heard that her child was going to be cut in half? You see, moms will do anything to protect their kids, won't they? Mothers will even be willing to give their kids away if it means it will save their life. And Solomon somehow knows that. He somehow understands that. Notice the response of the lying woman in verse 26 here. But the other said, neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two. You got to think that as soon as she said that, she knew, right? But it's too late. It's too late. She knew that her identity had been exposed. The truth is clear. Solomon's ready for his verdict here. Verse 27. Then the king gave his ruling. Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is the mother. Now notice he says first, do not kill him, just in case the guard's a little hasty, right? Hold back. Don't kill him. The real mother has been identified, and it's that one right there. What a story, right? Would you have thought of that? The text then describes the outcome of the situation. Look at verse 28. When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. You see, when people saw what Solomon did, they said, he's not just a smart guy. He's got wisdom from God. They began to tell their friends. They began to tell their family. Can you believe what the king did? He said, cut the baby in two, and everybody thought that was going to happen. We thought he'd lost his mind, but he was wise. He was extremely wise. He's not just a smart guy, but he's got wisdom from God. You see, what do we learn here in this text? We learn that Solomon is living and ruling empowered by God. He's able to discern the difficult situation. Again, not because he's smart, not because he's read legal cases, not because he's studied psychology. He doesn't know again, you got to remember, in this day and time is a very simple legal system. There wasn't the sciences that we have today for Solomon to come up with this. You see, he's doing it because he's empowered by God to do it. He's wise. And the author of 1 Kings reminds us this is a gift from God. Now, I want to just show you, this story even made its way into popular culture, right? Now, we've heard this story before, right? And it makes total sense because we've heard the story. But you got to remember, Solomon had not heard this story before. He was living in a world, again, that was brutal. He was living in a world that had very little respect for women, much less prostitutes, had a very simple system of laws. Again, he had no tools in his belt to handle this situation. And here we see the king, King Solomon, taking time for the lowly, discerning the truth in the most complex of situations. Only God can equip a king like this. We read of David in Acts chapter 13 in our series last year. I found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do whatever I want him to do. And now we have Solomon, David's son. Again, at this point in his life, in tune with God, given wisdom by God. Now again, Solomon's not going to be perfect. We're going to see as we continue to study this story, he's going to make mistakes. He's going to do things that are not in line with God's heart. But here we have Solomon in a posture of dependence on God, and God is giving him all that he needs. We learn from this story that there's more than just knowledge, right? There is wisdom, and wisdom is deeper. Well, knowledge, in many ways, has to do with understanding something, whether it's science or whether it's principles of law or psychology, and then just kind of going with those principles. But what Solomon is doing is Solomon is discerning. Now, discerning is different from knowledge. And let's talk about that for just a minute as we close this morning. When we discern, we aren't just saying, well, it seems like we should do this and deciding something. It's asking God, God, how am I going to handle this? What is going to happen here? How can my heart be in line with your heart, and how can I live that out? That's what it means to discern. You see, as a church, we have to learn to discern. See, too many times, churches operate just like businesses, right? It's all about profit loss. It's all about efficiency. It's all about production. But we as a church need to be sensitive to what God's calling us to do, right? And when God prompts us to do something, then we do it. And that's how we live. Some churches function, they simply copy other churches. They see this program or this ministry. It looks good, it works good over there, so maybe we should just do that. But again, when we are discerning the Spirit of God, it's not about copying another church. It's about saying, God, what do you want us to do? It's living in dependence on God and then following that through. Maybe this morning you're in a life situation that's complex. Maybe this morning you don't know how to handle something. Maybe it's a particular job. Maybe it's another life decision that you need to make, and you're kind of at the end of your rope. Let me challenge you this morning to call on God, to ask God, God, would you give me the wisdom to discern how you want me to handle this? You see, when we confess to God, we say, God, I can't do this on my own. I need you to handle it. That's when God steps in, and that's when God provides what we need. You see, we can rest assured that God will always do that. He's done it for us, hasn't He, by giving His life on a cross for us. When we say, God, I've got a sin problem. I can't handle it on my own. I cannot do this without you. He came and died on a cross for us, and He can give us the power that we need. God also said that when we believe in Him, that He gives us the Holy Spirit to live in us. And the Holy Spirit leads us and guides us. Now, certainly, Solomon had a special wisdom by God. But if we fast forward to the New Testament, Jesus said to us, I will come to you, and I will live in you. You see, in many ways, we can be like Solomon, saying, God, I don't know how to handle this, but we know that you do. Maybe this morning, God would be calling you to depend on Him in some way. You know, when you depend on God, He surprises you. When you depend on God, many times you find yourself with your jaw dropped going, holy cow, how did that happen? I didn't see that one. I didn't see that one coming, right? And it's a different sort of deal, isn't it, than when you just go a certain direction and work something out on your own, as opposed to saying, I can't do this on my own, and God shows up, and God surprises you. This morning, as we close, maybe there's some decision that you would like to make. Again, maybe you've got a sin problem, and you don't know how to handle that. Let me invite you to call on Jesus this morning. He's given His life for you on the cross. And if you'll simply call out to Him, He'll come, and He'll live in you, and He'll be with you. Maybe this morning there's something else that you're wrestling with, and you just need to come and pray this morning. The altar's open for you to do that. Maybe you need to come and pray with me, or would like to come and pray with me. I'll be standing down front. This morning, may we all be like Solomon. May we call on God to discern, to give us the wisdom that we need for every situation. Let's stand and sing together.